Good morning, everyone, and welcome. I call this meeting of the NCUA Board to order. First, I note for the record that Board Member Otska is joining us virtually today. Welcome. In addition to those joining us in the room, I also note for the record that today's meeting is open to the public through a live webcast. There being no further opening remarks, let's now turn to our agenda. The first item of business today is the Share Insurance Fund quarterly report board briefing. Eugene Shi, the NCUA's Chief Financial Officer, will present the item. Joining Eugene to answer the questions from the board are Kelly Lay, Director, Office of Examination and Insurance, and Andy Leventis, NCUA's Chief Economist. Good morning, everyone. Eugene, Kelly, and Andy, please, you may begin whenever you are ready.
Good morning, Chairman Harper, Vice Chairman Hauptman, and Board Member Otska. I am pleased to present the 2024 third quarter statistics for the Share Insurance Fund. Before I discuss the financial statements, I want to mention that KPMG, under the direction from the NCUA's Office of the Inspector General, performed an audit of NCUA's schedule of investments, accounts receivable, net other than intergovernmental, and other taxes and receipts as of September 30th, 2024. The audit was conducted in accordance with applicable accounting standards for the purpose of providing financial information to the U.S. Department of Treasury and the U.S. Government Accountability Office to use in preparing and auditing the financial report of the United States government. The report found that the schedules were fairly presented in all material respects. There were no internal control deficiencies identified, and the schedule was considered to be material weaknesses, and there were no instances of non-compliance or other matters as required under Government Auditing Standards or OMB Bulletin 2402. Slide number 2. The table shows reserve revenues and expenses for the third quarter of 2024. For the quarter ended September 30th, the fund recorded net income of $72.2 million. A few highlights are as follows. The total income was $145.8 million for the quarter, mainly from investment income of Treasury securities. Investment income increased 4% compared to the prior quarter and increased 29% compared to the third quarter of 2023. Operating expenses were $62.4 million for the quarter, primarily due to the overhead transfer of agency operating expenses. The provision for insurance loss reserve expense increased by $21.7 million during the quarter, primarily due to credit union-specific items and macroeconomic trends. Finally, the corporate AME loss reduction was $10.5 million, driven by favorable changes in estimated future cash flows of legacy assets. Slide 3. This table shows the fund's balance sheet as of September 30th, 2024, compared to the previous quarter. As of September 30th, total assets were valued at $22.6 billion, of which 97% were funds held with the U.S. Treasury in cash, overnight investments, and long-term Treasury notes. A few highlights to take away from this slide are the fund recognized the capitalization deposit receivable of $455.8 million for credit unions with assets over $50 million. Accounts payable and other liabilities includes a capitalization deposit refund totaling $90.1 million to credit unions with lower insured shares. This refund was paid to those credit unions in October. The cumulative results of operation increased by $541.2 million due to $72.2 million in net income and a reduction in unrealized losses on investments of $469 million. Slide 4. The fund records an insurance program liability comprised of general and specific reserves. This is a contingency to cover anticipated future losses resulting from insured credit union failures. Each quarter, we assess the reserve needs for potential and actual credit union failures to make a reasonable estimate of potential future losses. During the third quarter, the reserve balance increased by $19.8 million, primarily due to an increase in the general reserves. The reserve balance totaled $231.8 million and is comprised of $8 million in specific reserves and $223.8 million for general reserves. Slide 5. As of September 30th, 2024, 2 credit union failures incurred losses to the fund during the year. There were no credit union failures that incurred a loss to the fund during the third quarter of 2024. Slide 6. As of September 30th, 2024, the fund had $22.8 billion at par invested in Treasury securities with maturities out to May of 2031. The weighted average yield for securities held by the fund is 2.4 years. The weighted average yield of securities decreased 6 basis points from the last quarter to 2.48% because of lower interest on the overnights. During the third quarter of 2024, 8 Treasury notes matured, totaling $700 million. These securities that matured had yields ranging from 0.2% to 1.75%. These maturities were subsequently reinvested during the quarter at higher yields, partially offsetting the decline in the overnights and helping to provide long-term earnings stability. Slide 7. The equity ratio is updated on a semi-annual basis. As of June 30th, 2024, the equity ratio was 1.28% and was calculated using an insured share base of $1.76 trillion. The blue line across the chart represents the normal operating level, which I will discuss further on the next slide. Slide 8. Slide 8 provides an update on the normal operating level. The normal operating level, or NOL, is the target equity ratio for the fund as set by the NCUA board. The Federal Credit Union Act requires the board to set the normal operating level between 1.20% and 1.50% of industry-insured shares. This level is significant because if the year-end equity ratio exceeds the normal operating level and other statutory conditions are met, then the excess must be distributed to credit unions. The normal operating level was last set and approved by the board in December 2021 and remains unchanged at 1.33%. Board-approved policy adopted in 2017 and revised in 2021 includes 3 primary objectives in setting the normal operating level. First, to retain public confidence in federal share insurance. Second, to prevent impairment of the 1% contributed capital deposit. And finally, ensure that the fund can withstand a moderate recession without the equity ratio declining below 1.20% over a 5-year period. A staff working group will prepare a public notice for the board to consider and release in 2025. This notice would likely propose and seek comment on modifications to the NOL methodology, which could then be considered by the board in 2025. Slide 9. This slide shows the percentage of insured shares in CAMEL's codes from 2019 through the third quarter of 2024. In the graph, the dark blue represents CAMEL's coded 4 or 5. The gray represents CAMEL's code 3, and the light blue at the bottom is CAMEL's code 1 in 2 credit unions. During the quarter, the percentage of insured shares at credit unions CAMEL's coded 3, 4, and 5 decreased slightly, while CAMEL codes 1 and 2 increased. The table at the bottom of the graph shows the number of credit unions by CAMEL's code. The total number of credit unions as of September 30th was 4,508. This is a decrease of 25 credit unions from the prior quarter. Slide 10. Slide 10 compares the credit union's CAMEL's codes by asset size. CAMEL's coded 4 and 5 credit unions are shown on the left-hand side. CAMEL code 3 credit unions are shown on the right side. Looking at the 138 credit unions CAMEL's coded 4 and 5, most of these credit unions continue to have assets of $100 million or less. For those credit unions with assets greater than $100 million, the number of credit unions remain unchanged from the prior quarter. During the quarter, both assets and insured shares in credit unions, Camel Codes 4 and 5 decreased. Considering the 730 credit unions, Camel's Code 3, 91% of these credit unions have assets less than $500 million. During the quarter, there was a decrease in credit unions with assets less than $100 million and in the $100 to $500 million range, and an increase in credit unions with greater than $500 million for Camel's Code 3. During the quarter, both assets and insured shares for credit unions and Camel's Code 3 institutions decreased. And slide 11. The supplemental slides to this presentation provide more information on investments and other aspects of the fund to help interested parties better understand the operations of the fund. Thank you for your time. This concludes my presentation, and we will be happy to take your questions.
Thank you, Eugene, as always, for your insightful presentation on the National Credit Union Share Insurance Fund's performance in the third quarter of 2024. And thank you to the entire team in the Office of the Chief Financial Officer who helped to manage the fund and produce this quarterly briefing, as well as all of the financial statements that go into the government's year-end accounting. I know that that is no easy task, and you get to turn around and do it in another 3 months so that we can have our calendar year the way the NCUA operates. Kelly and Andy, I also appreciate both in having you here to be available to answer any questions that the board may have. Overall, the Share Insurance Fund's performance in the third quarter was strong, yet we continue to find ourselves in a good news, bad news scenario. Let me start with the good news. The ongoing changes in the interest rate environment reduced the fund's unrealized losses. In fact, since December 2022 until today, the fund has experienced nearly a $1 billion increase. This change resulted in the fund's total assets reaching nearly $22.6 billion. Adding to the financial strength of the fund, quarterly investment income has risen a healthy $12 million since the first quarter of 2024, thanks in part to the interest rate environment and to a shift into higher yielding short-term investments and overnights. The rise in interest income, along with continuing low levels of insurance losses, contributes to an equity ratio of 1.28%. Although this figure is less than the board-approved normal operating level of 1.33%, it ensures a healthy, countercyclical fund that maintains sufficient reserves in good times to prevent us from having to charge premiums in economic downturns when credit unions can least afford it. Also of note, on slide 8, the NCUA board will be issuing the normal operating level methodology for public comment next year. I'm encouraging all stakeholders now to look out for that request and to send in your feedback. It is an important part of the NCUA board's job to determine where the normal operating level is set. Eugene, my first question pertains to investment income. We saw a notable increase in income in the first and second quarters. However, in the third quarter, that figure was generally flat, as I did the math, compared to the previous quarter. Why is that?
Thank you for that. So the investment income is really kind of coming from two streams. First, the overnights, and there's about $5.5 to $5.6 billion, the current target range in the overnights. That's pretty closely associated with the what actions the Fed takes on interest rates, and they started to decrease interest rates during the quarter. So the income on the overnight investments started to come down.
Wasn't as robust.
Right.
Yeah.
Again, counterbalancing that a little bit is the reinvestment that we're doing into the ladder. And as I noted, the securities that matured during this quarter were considerably lower than the rate that we were able to reinvest at. So we're reinvesting in the ladder, and that portion of the ladder is earning more income. So those two are kind of roughly offsetting each other at this point.
Okay. Thank you. If we could turn to slide 3. On slide 3, we see more than a $1 billion increase, quarterly increase in the fund's total assets because of changes in unrealized losses and the capitalization of deposits, which you mentioned earlier. I should really say the net capitalization of deposits as some money was returned. Will this trend continue for the foreseeable future? And also, how would the potential for further interest rate cuts by the Federal Open Market Committee affect the portfolio?
Okay, if the Fed were to continue to cut rates, then I'd expect, again, that we'd continue to see a decline on the overnight part of the portfolio, which right now is at about 25% of the total portfolio. So it's a sizable amount that we do still have in the overnights. Unrealized losses pertain to our investment in the ladder. Fed action can certainly impact the ladder, but is also influenced by the bond market and longer-term rates that aren't directly controlled by the Fed. Those longer-term rates, such as the benchmark 10-year, have also come down a little bit, reducing that helps to reduce the unrealized losses that the portfolio's had. As for capitalization deposits, those tend to be fairly cyclical.
Right.
So we see usually an increase in our capitalization deposit adjustment in the cycle 2 that we've just gone through. And then when we do cycle 1 in the spring, based on second half of 2024 insured share deposit changes, that's usually a bit smaller, or even in the past 2 years, we've actually refunded slightly more than we've collected.
Gotcha. Thank you, Eugene. Amidst the positive signs, there are a few areas for concern that reinforce the need to focus our supervisory efforts of credit risk, liquidity risk, and interest rate risk. As noted earlier, we continue to see signs of financial strain on credit union balance sheets and consumer financial stress. And we're seeing this play out in a number of credit unions and the percentage of assets held by composite Camels Code 3, 4, and 5 credit unions. Of greatest concern to me has been the large number of troubled Camels Code 4 and 5 credit unions, especially the 9 troubled complex credit unions with more than $500 million in assets. And although down slightly this quarter, the numbers of Camels Code 3 institutions remains elevated. Together, the total assets held in composite Camels Code 3, 4, and 5 credit unions accounts for nearly 10% of the system's aggregate assets. These conditions are another reason why our supervision of these and all federally insured credit unions must remain risk-focused. They also highlight the need for the NCUA's examiners to be ready to act expeditiously when identifying problems. Eugene, if you could turn to slide 4, would you discuss the changes in reserve balance compared to a year ago? The reserves are up by a large margin, even though the losses to the fund remain relatively low. What's at play here?
Thank you for that question. So the reserves have 2 components. There's a specific reserve, which we record when a loss to a specific credit union is both probable and estimable. So we know something is more likely to happen than not, and we record a specific amount for that estimated loss. And then there's a general reserve, which is more a gauge on what unforeseen events may play out, given a variety of inputs such as economic metrics. It's more of a predictor of what could happen and provides us a prudent estimate of what level of reserve we should be holding.
I appreciate that. Let's turn to slide 5 if we could. Losses from credit union failures have remained low, as we discussed, yet we are seeing risks grow from some of our larger credit unions, as you just mentioned. Kelly, what are we doing to ensure that these larger credit unions remain safe and sound?
So there are actually multiple things that come to mind. First, we have an annual exam cycle for all of our credit unions that are $1 billion in assets and greater. And if we identify credit unions and assign a CAMEL 3, 4, or 5, we ramp up our supervision efforts there and do regular monitoring. My office, Office of Examination Insurance, and the regions also do regular monitoring, looking for outliers and emerging risks, and particularly focus on the larger credit unions when we do that too. And then additionally, we provide training both to our credit unions and to our examiners. So we do that through webinars, issue guidance, and so that helps, I think, with those efforts as well.
I appreciate that. Kelly, one of the things that we've heard quite a bit of talk about, and especially we've been looking closely at the Financial Stability Oversight Council, is the amount of commercial real estate exposure and the resetting of rates, and how there may be some difficulties given the vacancies that we are seeing in office buildings. Are any of our large credit unions overly exposed? And by large, I'm talking about complex above $500 million.
Yeah, so we did do a special look at our credit union industry and any credit unions that may be, have elevated risk because of the risks there in the commercial portfolios. We have a handful of credit unions that we're monitoring, but nothing that would be overly concerning right now
So-
or risk to the fund.
So
Yeah.
we are somewhat insulated against that potential risk, which is good news. But we also know that once a risk starts to happen, it could start to play out in different ways onto our balance sheets.
Correct.
Great, all right. Let's turn to slide 9, if we could. Kelly, what accounts for the modest drop in total assets held at composite Camels Code 3, 4, and 5 institutions over the quarter? Have we bottomed out?
So I took a look at, some of those credit unions and where we're seeing upgrades and downgrades. And as you know, over the past few years, we've identified credit unions with liquidity risk and interest rate risk concerns. And we're actually starting to see some upgrades of those credit unions as they
That's
have
good.
taken corrective action. However, we're also seeing some new downgrades as in credit unions where liquidity risk and interest rate risk are now impacting earnings and capital. And we're also seeing, credit risk concerns play out in these institutions as well. So you have some upgrades, but you have some downgrades. So I wouldn't say we've bottomed out. We're maybe in a new phase.
There's some give and take going on here.
Exactly.
Great, thank you, Kelly. Protecting the share insurance fund and the hard-earned share deposits of credit union members has always been a top priority of mine. Credit union members and the taxpayers who ultimately guarantee the share insurance fund rely on our supervisory efforts to ensure that their savings are secure now and in the future. I have every faith that the NCUA team will continue to work to uphold the tradition and the responsibility that comes with successfully managing the share insurance fund. That concludes my remarks. I now turn to the Vice Chairman
Thank you.
for his.
Yep. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Another nice job, CFO's office. Kelly, how did you get roped into this today? Wait, because you're not, just to be clear, CFO's office normally does this. That's who prepared this. Kelly is the head of examinations and insurance and is not normally always when we do these updates, correct?
Correct.
How did you arrive at this table today?
So I have presented with Eugene a couple of times around the
Yeah.
share insurance fund, but some of the questions, related to our problem credit unions and the normal operating level, I felt it was important for me to be at the table as well.
When you say the questions, what questions are you referring to?
Oh, questions from the board.
That you were told before today would be coming, and so that's why you decided to be here today.
Yeah, as we participated with Eugene in the briefings prior to the public board meeting, there were questions that came about that I wanted to make sure I was at the table for.
Who delivered those questions? Whose questions were they?
So I received questions from Chairman Harper,
Okay.
and I know when we were in your briefing, we had some questions come up there as well.
Okay. All right. No, nothing wrong with it. It's just normally a CFO's thing. And I was like, what meetings have Kelly here, which ones do not? And I think you'd want to know that too, but you do already. Eugene, right at the beginning, you said probably the one sentence that credit unions, if anybody watches this, would perk up. Refunds sent back to credit unions. Can you just review what that is and the manner it was refunded to who?
Sure. So we do the adjustment for the capitalization deposit on a semi-annual basis. And in cycle 1 is usually billed in March and collected in April.
We collect from credit unions.
We collect from credit unions or we refund. We do the adjustment based on changes in insured shares.
Is this what we call true up?
Yes, it would be
It's the same thing,
commonly
right?
called as the true-up. And during the first cycle, all credit unions do the true-up, unless, of course, their insured shares stayed exactly the same, in which case there would be no change. In the second half of the year, cycle 2, it's credit unions $50 million and larger in insured shares do the true-up.
And in layman's terms, why did you have a refund to give to credit unions this time?
So if their insured shares were declining,
Right.
we return money to them.
And the mechanism for returning the money is what?
So it's electronic payment.
We pay them
Yes.
direct. What I mean is, when I have an apartment I rent out, and sometimes when she pays for a repair, electrician or something, I can either reimburse her or she can just take it off the rent. Right, it's the same thing. It's just a question of timing. That's what I'm trying to get at here. In some cases, is that you have to pay us, but the way we're going to refund you this money is you just have to pay us less. That's another way for them to get the
Sure.
cash, right?
No, we, for the cycle 2 deposits, we're either collecting money for those that have increased insured shares, or we're actually returning money to the credit unions whose insured shares declined. So
Gotcha.
it's not offsetting.
So no one out there, when they hear the word refund, the reason I'm doing this is just to make clear that somebody hears the word refund, they hear the word millions of dollars. Have I got my money? Am I going to get my money? I wanted to make sure that anybody who is going to or not going to, the matter is concluded, right?
Yes.
Okay. The reason I want to clarify is this has come up a couple times here when we were returning money, winding down the corporates. People were unclear. Am I
Sure.
getting money? If so, how do I get it? Do I check my mailbox for a check? Do I check
Yep.
my account? And people were wondering, is this all of it? Am I waiting for money? Right? So that's the only reason I wanted to go through the mechanics of that was
Sure.
that I'm aware that in this case, credit unions are used to it because like you say, it's a yearly cycle.
Yes.
But again, somebody might have just heard the word millions
Okay.
of dollars refunded to credit unions, and I would sure peek up. Let me go back to my prepared remarks here. As stated, we had net income of 72 million. On the other hand, unrealized losses declined by almost $500 million. And short-term interest rates have fallen lately, and our unrealized losses in a fund have decreased. All of that I just said is good for the SIF. We saw the Fed has lowered base points by 75 basis points, has lowered interest rates by 75 basis points. They've ended their hiking cycle. They had a pause, and now so far they're on the way down to the tune of 75 basis points, and it's about 50-50 whether next month the Fed lowers another quarter point. And while inflation has fallen, inflation hurts the SIF by definition because it hurts the value of bonds. Bonds we currently hold, put it that way, if it's unexpected. But inflation feels like the house dust that just won't go away. It's now been 44 consecutive months with inflation above the Fed's 2% target. In any event, NCUA is keeping its overnight holdings at $5.5 billion. Is that about right?
Yep.
And investing new money back into our bond ladder. There's no change to the NOL at this time. As a reminder, it was set and approved by the board in December 2021 at 1.33. That was reduced from 1.39, or 8 at the time, 8. Thus far, that change hasn't affected distributions since the SIF hasn't had enough money where we'd have sent back to credit unions in either scenario. It's been an academic matter so far. And in next year, 2025, an NCUA staff working group will prepare a public notice to seek comment, as the chairman mentioned, on modifications to the NOL. If you or your trade group, I'm speaking to credit unions now, want to weigh in, I recommend preparing your questions in advance. It was noted in our discussion about this before the meeting that if you use a 5-year look back, the suggested NOL would be lower than where it is now. But insurance, by definition, is for the unexpected and and they tend to be outliers. It tends to be the end of the bell curve. A 5-year look back right now is a little bit like looking at the first 6 months of the year for determining hurricane insurance, because the hurricane season starts in the summer and goes till the fall. Anytime that's your chosen period, wow, January through May, we didn't have a lot of hurricanes. Well, yeah, it's a cycle. You'd say, well, this is a good thing. The 5-year look back doesn't show a whole lot of losses. And it's not that a credit union could blow up. It's that credit union problems are correlated to each other. There's a reason they tend to all happen at once. It's not a parlay like in gambling where they're independent events. They are correlated. So I have a question. The way that regular insurers often frame these things for their shareholders and policyholders is putting it in normal terms like NOL and equity ratio. These aren't things that I think normal people understand. Like, are you going to have the money or not? You know, that's what people want to know.
Right.
The way they frame it is, you know, we could have 3 years and we could have 3 Hurricane Sandys this year and be solvent, right? What's the largest check we would have to write before we would not be, we would automatically fall below 1.20, whether it's one big credit union failure or a bunch of them? How much cash written tomorrow would drive us below 1.20?
So based on the information in the presentation today and sort of that hypothetical, if we had to write a check tomorrow, at this point, the fund could withstand a loss of $1.4 billion, which would drop the equity ratio to about 1.20%. I will note that this does fluctuate over time.
Of course it does.
And particularly as it relates to total insured shares as they rise and fall. So the $1.4 billion metric has been true for about the last year or so. But if you remember your time, sir,
Yeah.
when you first joined the
Yep.
board and we were looking at an equity ratio closer to 1.20%, at that moment in time, a $200 million loss would have taken the fund below.
All I heard about when I started, I was sworn in December 2020, was, is NCUA going to drop below? Because they had to literally change their budgets if there was even a possibility, because Congress says below 1.20, we have 6 months to create a plan. And I remember people saying if they were right, because it was the flood of stimulus money, and if they were right, that it was sort of a tide going in that would naturally go out. I said, I'm not arguing with you, because people would say, no, this is a temporary thing. These aren't actually losses. It's just a flood of money in that throws off the numbers. I said, you're right, but we can put that in the plan. We can literally write that in the plan, and then it self-destructs after a few months, and we all go home, and it goes right. But the mere notion that we might be close to having to put together a plan required by Congress to refresh the money in this changed everything. It was the only thing I heard about when I started, right? So that's what I'm trying to get at. We could have a credit union fail and 1.4 billion and insured deposits are gone, and we have to write a check to cover it. We can do up to 1.4 billion before we would have to put together a plan that might involve sending bills to credit unions around the country. Another way to put it, we could have 14 $100 million losses at 14 different credit unions and sustain it. Okay. That's how I'd want to look at it at the end of the day. How big of a loss before I have to pull out my checkbook and send something to the NCUA on top of what I normally do? And what was the largest check written this year?
So for a check written related to an insurance-related loss of a failed institution this year, was an assisted merger payment that was right about $2 million.
$2 million, okay, right. Assisted emergent payment is, to me, the same thing. It's the money we have putting out in
Right.
order to stem a problem.
Yep.
Okay, that concludes my remarks. Back to Chairman Harper.
Thank you so much. First of all, I share your concerns about black swans, and timing is everything, and part of our job is to anticipate the black swans. If I could just follow up on, Eugene, I just did some back of the envelope math based on the vice chairman. Going below 1.2% is concerning, but going below 1% is even worse. I think you would agree.
And even worse is going to the taxpayer to have to re-up the whole thing.
Exactly. Just did
Yeah.
some back of the envelope math, and if 1.4 billion over 13 basis points, and then you use a 33 basis point drop to get to that 1%, we've got about $3.55 billion loss would take us below that. Generally, Kelly, if I remember correctly, my math, we lose between 20 and 30% of a credit union's assets. So let's multiply that by 5. We're talking, a couple of credit unions totaling $16 billion. Isn't that really close to the $14 billion that we have sitting right now in troubled Campbell's Code 4 and 5 credit unions?
It is.
So we've got to really have to watch this. All right, thank you. Board Member Otska.
Thanks, Chair Harper, and thank you, Eugene, for the briefing, and Andy and Kelly for being here to answer questions. So being stewards of the Share Insurance Fund is one of NCUA's primary jobs. I think we all know that. It's a critical component of our duty to protect members' shares at credit unions. So I continue to be encouraged by the strong performance of the SIF. The trend of fewer failing credit unions combined with higher yields is consistent, and we're still seeing substantial net income for the fund. Since September 2023, the fund's net income has grown by about 88 million, and the fund continues to have strong yields. This quarter, the fund's yield was 2.48%, a little bit lower than last quarter's, but still above previous levels. So Eugene, I think you've alluded to this a little bit, but can you provide some more context for that slight decrease in yield from last quarter? I believe in June it was about 2.54%, and now it's 2.48%. Not a huge cause for concern necessarily, but just helpful for the board and for external stakeholders and the public to understand.
Sure. So the drop in the weighted average yield is attributable to a decline in interest rates. So the interest rates have stabilized, as has been alluded to. The Fed has started to lower rates, which in turn reduces our earnings on the overnight portfolio. And so if the Fed were to continue to do that, then the SIF would plausibly see a continued decrease in the overnights. And again, sort of counterweighting that is we still have a consistent quarterly flow of maturities coming due. And as we reinvest those, they are generally still at this point rolling off at lower rates than we're able to reinvest at. So again, these two sides of the coin are kind of offsetting each other at this point. But that does, what it does help us do in terms of the longer-term interest rates is to create some stability long-term for the fund so that it, as the Fed reduces rates, we hopefully don't see the weighted average yield for the fund continue to go down. That concludes my response.
Okay, thanks, Eugene. That's helpful clarification. So I mentioned this in May as well. My primary concern in getting these updates is the growth in the asset size among riskier credit unions, those with the CAMELS 3 rating and higher. Between June and September this year, the percentage of shares held by the CAMELS 3 credit unions stayed pretty steady. The fact that it hasn't increased, which has happened over the last 4 consecutive quarters, is a positive sign. I think we've kind of touched on that as well. But it is still at the highest level we've seen since 2017. So I think, it's important to me for us to continue to monitor those credit unions very closely and make sure that, the fund is in good shape. Furthermore, the percentage of assets for credit unions with a CAMELS 4 or 5 also still remains elevated at 0.8%. The last publicly available quarterly data summary showed a decrease in net income for credit unions of 10% when comparing the first half of 2023 to the first half of 2024. The delinquency rate was also up 21 basis points when comparing quarter 2 2023 to quarter 2 of 2024. I think there are signs of weakness in credit card lending, auto loans, and mortgage lending, and some other areas. So I guess, Kelly, this is probably an appropriate question for you. What steps, and I think you also kind of touched on this in your responses to other board members, but what steps can we take to further safeguard the fund in case these kind of these risks persist, these trends persist?
Thank you. So I do think there are a few things we can do. First, having a strong examination and supervision program is paramount. Identifying risks early and ensuring corrective action is timely is the key to preventing losses to the Share Insurance Fund. We've also already started working on the supervisory priorities, and we'll be offering, training to both the industry and to our exam staff when those are finalized. Additionally, as Eugene mentioned during the briefing, we do plan to work on a request for information to the industry to consider alternatives to the methodology for setting the normal operating level. And what we learned from that request, information that we learn in evaluating various alternatives could result in our ability to further safeguard the fund. That concludes my response.
Okay, thank you, Kelly. Appreciate that. So while there's many signs that show stability and growth of the Share Insurance Fund, now is the time to think about what can go wrong and how to safeguard against those scenarios, especially as we enter a period of changing interest rates. And it's important as the board for us to continue to keep a close eye on those potential stressors to the fund to ensure credit union members are ultimately protected, because that's really what it's all about. Thank you all for your presentation. I don't have any other questions. Back to you, Chair Harper.
Thank you so much, Board Member Otska, and thank you, Eugene, Kelly, and Andy. That concludes our quarterly Share Insurance Fund briefing. But Eugene, before you leave the table, we have a very important game this weekend between Indiana University and Ohio State University. One of us is undefeated at this point in time. Can we have a gentleman's agreement that the loser of this game has to wear the winner's team paraphernalia and get a picture with that?
Certainly.
All righty. Thank you so much. The next item on our agenda today is being heard in the NCUA Board's capacity as the Central Liquidity Facilities Board. That agenda item is the Central Liquidity Facilities 2025 and 2026 budgets. Staff presenting are Anthony Capetta, President of the Central Liquidity Facility, and Tim Dodd, Vice President of the Central Liquidity Facility. Good morning to you both, Anthony and Tim. Please start whenever you are ready.
Thank you.
You didn't go to Ohio State, did you?
No, I'm a Penn State grad, which is currently number 4 in the nation.
Oh, and Indiana's number 5. Yeah, we can talk about strength of schedule. Anthony.
Good morning, Chairman Harper, Vice Chairman Hauptman, and Board Member Otska. Tim and I are here today to request the Board's approval of the Central Liquidity Facility, or CLF for short, 2025-2026 budget. Next slide, please. The CLF, as one of only 2 federal contingent liquidity providers, must stand ready to support the financial stability of member credit unions by providing liquidity for short-term, seasonal, and protracted needs. The 2025-26 budget request considers both the need to maintain routine operations and a potential for surges in both membership, applications, and the processing of a large number of liquidity advances should there be a systemic liquidity event. Presented here are the CLF's financial highlights. As a reminder to stakeholders, the CLF's monthly financial statements are posted on the CLF page of ncua.gov. As of September 30th, 2024, the CLF had 430 regular members and 11 corporate correspondents. Regular membership grew by 31 net new members year over year and now helps safeguard 9.4% of all credit unions and their 24 million members, $331 billion in shares and deposits. Total assets of the CLF are $966 million, and those assets have produced a year-to-date net income after dividend of $2.9 million. Year-to-date operating expenses are $1.6 million, and they are trending just below budget. Retained earnings are $44 million and provide a base for borrowing, support risks inherent in operations, including interest rate and credit risks, and they support the cost of operations. The third quarter 2024 dividend was 4.46%, or $9.8 million. The total dividends and interest paid to CLF members so far this year was $30.1 million. The total $1.81 billion of subscribed capital, stock, and surplus provides the CLF a statutory borrowing authority of $21.7 billion, which is a year-over-year increase of nearly $2 billion. And this provides a significant amount of contingent liquidity available for both our members and the credit union system. I'll now turn the presentation over to Tim to discuss the details of the proposed 2025-26 CLF budget.
Thank you, Anthony. Next slide, please. Effective liquidity, interest rate, credit risk management are key components of a credit union's safety and soundness. And although the Federal Reserve has recently lowered interest rates, many financial institutions are still grappling with the rapid rate hikes of 2022 and 2023 and the recently increasing delinquencies. These recent economic fluctuations have underscored the importance of having access to diverse sources of liquidity, including reliable contingent sources like that of the Central Liquidity Facility. The Central Liquidity Facility utilizes investment income to cover operating expenses, meet retained earnings objectives, and then distributes the remaining proceeds as dividends on paid-in capital and interest to liquidity reserve and clearing accounts. Accordingly, the proposed CLF budget recognizes estimates of revenue, retained earnings, and member distributions while outlining operational expenditures. Investment income year-to-date in the third quarter was $34.5 million. Fed fund futures and forward curves were employed to project the remaining 2024 and 2025 investment income of $44.9 million and $36.8 million, respectively. The CLF's investment income is closely correlated to short-term interest rates, and the projected 2025 decrease in investment income reflects market expectations of declines in overnight and short-term rates. These estimates are subject to change with market conditions. Operating expenses are projected to be $2.1 million in 2024 and increase to $2.3 million in 2025. Dividend and interest distributions to CLF members are anticipated to be $38.9 million in 2024 and decrease to $31 million in 2025. Since the CLF's investment income is the source for funding member dividends, The level of dividend distributions is subject to changes in investment portfolio performance. In 2025, the CLF plans to increase retained earnings by $3.5 million as the growth of CLF membership and borrowing authority necessitates additional reserves to absorb any unexpected costs or losses and provide a source of revenue to fund operations. This increase is projected to result in cumulative retained earnings of $48.5 million in 2025. Next slide, please. The proposed CLF budget reflects estimated annual needs of $2.3 million for 2025 and $2.4 million for 2026. These expenses represent year-over-year increases of 4.9% and 6.1% respectively. Although the proposed budget increase exceeds headline consumer price inflation of 2.6% over the year ending in October, it is slightly below the assumed 5.2% increase in NCUA's compensation agreement, to which the CLF's expenses are closely tied. Total pay and benefits increased by 26% in 2025 to $2.1 million, which makes up 93% of the CLF's proposed annual budget. The total pay and benefits subtotal increase reflects the filling of a vacant full-time equivalent staff member position, the merit and locality pay increases required by NCUA's collective bargaining agreement, as well as promotions and other mandatory employer contributions, including health insurance and retirement. Total authorized staffing is expected to remain at 6 positions for 2025 and 2026. Next, total non-pay and other expenses are proposed at $158,000, which is a decrease of 68% from prior year expectations. This significant decrease is primarily due to the reduction in contracted services, with these responsibilities now handled by the vacant staff member position mentioned previously. Due to the contingent nature of the CLF function, the contract services budget reflects expenses that may or may not be incurred and are directly related to the extent of increased CLF activities, such as rapid increases in CLF membership and processing large numbers of loan applications. Moderate increases in CLF activity are expected to be supported by existing staff and budgeted resources. However, a large increase in activity could exceed the capacity of the existing CLF staff, resulting in the need for obtaining additional contracted services. I will now turn it over to Anthony to discuss next year's planned activities.
Thank you, Tim. Next slide, please. In 2025, the CLF will continue to monitor liquidity conditions at the credit union and system levels, providing advances as needed. We will continue our efforts to grow and strengthen the CLF membership by thereby increasing credit unions' access to contingent liquidity. Increase our industry and stakeholder communications and outreach to promote the benefits and advantages of CLF membership, and this is including those with other federal entities, NCUA and state examiners, corporate credit unions, credit union leagues, and associations. And we will pursue new efficiencies and automations in the areas of advanced procedures and operations, further leveraging business intelligence platforms to drive operational improvements and gain actionable insights into existing and potential members and their liquidity. Next slide. That concludes our briefing, and now we'll be happy to answer any questions you may have. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Anthony and Tim, for your presentation and for the work of your team in bringing this request for the Central Liquidity Facility budget before the board for the 2025 and 2026 years. Authorized by Congress, the CLF was created by credit unions for credit unions, but it's operated and overseen by the NCUA. The NCUA board, in its statutory capacity as the CLF's executive body, must approve the CLF's budget. Last year was the first year the CLF's budget was presented separately from the NCUA's operating budget. This year, the board is considering the funding requests for the CLF on a 2-year cycle, which aligns with the NCUA's longstanding 2-year budget process that we've had in existence. As noted earlier, the proposed CLF budget amounts to just over $2.3 million for 2025 and $2.4 million for 2026. The modest increase in the facility's budget results from changes in personnel costs compared to the prior year, although the proposal includes one new full-time equivalent or one new position, as our chief financial officer often reminds me to say, being added to the CLF staff. The costs associated with that new individual are offset by reductions to the CLF's contracting line. This new employee will better distribute the workload across the team, facilitate succession planning, and allow the CLF's president in particular more time to engage with industry on the benefits of the CLF and how the facility can serve as an essential part of a comprehensive liquidity management program. This proposed budget is reasonable and prudent to the long-term needs of the CLF. As such, I will support it. There's an age-old maxim, there's strength in numbers. That's especially true here because the more members the CLF has, the more effective it becomes as a liquidity facility for the industry. The CLF currently, as of October 31st, I know you had September 30th numbers of 430 members. We added one in October, and so we are up to 431 regular members, plus 11 corporate credit union correspondents. The CLF's capacity, moreover, currently stands at $21.7 billion, compared to $20.1 billion approximately 1 year ago. That's steady improvement and welcome news, and I thank you both for leading your team in achieving that. Anthony, would you talk a little bit about the growth trends in the CLF membership during the last year, and also what are the general characteristics of these new members?
Yes, Chairman, and thank you for the question. This year's growth in membership, actually 34 new members, ranged in asset size from approximately $15 million to $4 billion. As a whole, they were almost evenly split, with 49% of them being less than $250 million in assets and 51% being greater. And we look at the $250 million asset level as that is the level at which a credit union is required by NCUA regulations to have access to a federal source of emergency liquidity like the CLF. Further, if we look at the L and CAMELs of the new members, 75% are CAMELs code 1, and 25% are 3, and there are no, or 0%, 4 or 5. Generally, credit unions who join the CLF are proactively thinking about their liquidity management and contingency funding plans. And lastly, I'll note that 26% of the new members also have Fed discount window access, which reinforces our belief that access to a federal contingent liquidity source is not solely a discount window or CLF approach, but can be both discount window and CLF. And that concludes my answer.
And Anthony, certainly there are some costs associated with joining the CLF and that you have to pledge assets, but you also get a return on that. Could you just briefly raise that?
Sure. During our brief, when we discussed the dividends that are returned, our member capital, paid-in member capital, provides our investment portfolio. Out of that, as Tim discussed, we subtract our expenses, the cost of what we need for operations, and the little bit we need to support the retained earnings to
Grow
go along
them,
with the increased
sure.
growth. And then everything else is returned to the members as dividends.
And how is that just in size of return? Is it equal to what the Fed pays on its deposits?
Yes, it depends on the interest rates, because of course they have a little bit of a jump on that. So as interest rates are going up, we tend to lead their return, and as they're going down, we tend to lag a little bit. But our rate of 4.56%, considering the option that they have to draw on our facility for liquidity, is, I think, a very good market rate and compares well to what the Fed does.
So it's an investment that not only gets a return, but it's an investment that helps to protect when a liquidity event hits.
Right. And although we like to provide a good dividend, a healthy dividend, and a market dividend to our members, it's important to note that joining the CLF is all about having the option to draw on emergency liquidity, not as an investment.
But it's not just emergency liquidity. It can be seasonal
Yes,
and
that's true.
other purposes.
Contingent liquidity.
Contingent liquidity.
Correct. Thank
Great.
you.
All right. Thank you for that information. Your response illustrates that the CLF can support all credit unions, not just ones with larger than $250 million in assets. My next question is, I really want to focus in on the smaller credit unions who are below that $250 million threshold. Why should they join the CLF?
Yes, thank you for that question. Of course, for all credit unions, having more liquidity sources is better. But smaller credit unions in particular, because of their smaller balance sheets and leaner operational capabilities, are more likely to experience an asset liability mismatch due to events outside their control. Examples could include meeting an unexpected or rapid loss in shares or non-member funds, an inability to address a surge in credit demands, such as unexpectedly high draws on outstanding lines of credits, or to meet liquidity needs due to forces outside their control, such as an internal operating problem like a cyber event or a natural disaster. I'll add that the ease and cost of joining the CLF is relatively low compared to its benefits, making it an affordable safeguard against liquidity challenges. By joining the CLF, smaller credit unions gain access to a reliable safety net, ensuring that they can continue to serve their members under difficult circumstances.
I really appreciate that answer. Although it's not required by our rules, having small and mid-sized credit unions with less than $250 million in assets join the CLF provides them with access to this vital federal liquidity backstop during times of stress. Once markets freeze up, I think you would agree, it's very difficult for institutions to quickly access emergency liquidity from market sources.
Yes.
Joining the CLF in advance of a liquidity event can better assist a credit union of any size in navigating unanticipated market situations. While the CLF is growing in its capacity, the congressional restoration of the expired CLF statutory enhancements, like the agent member provisions for corporate credit unions to serve a subset of their members, would serve the system as a whole well. That's why the NCUA board continues to call upon Congress to reinstate these provisions. And in fact, I know that we have unanimous views across the board here. Anthony, would you explain why this legislation is essential to a strong and responsive CLF?
Yes, and thank you for that question. Legislation enacting the proposed enhancements to Title III of the Credit Union Act would greatly enhance our ability to serve our members and would also have the added effects of both providing a no-cost to natural person credit union access to the CLF as a federal contingent liquidity source and to increase the resilience and strength of the entire credit union network. More CLF member capital translates into a larger CLF borrowing authority and therefore more funds available for the CLF to support our members, as well as the National Credit Union Share Insurance Fund through our statutory ability to lend to the SIF if needed. That concludes my answer.
And if memory serves me, Anthony, when the temporary enhancements expired, we saw about 3,300 credit unions which had agent member access lose that access. And those credit unions overall, that access resulted in a drop of $10 billion in total liquidity within the system.
Yes, that's correct.
So, I mean, it's really important, and thank you for clarifying. This legislation would better enable the CLF to serve as a shock absorber, as I often say, for future liquidity events within the credit union system. And in my written testimony before the House Financial Services Committee yesterday, I urged Congress to reinstate these provisions. I'm urging Congress again to do that today. President John F. Kennedy once famously said, "The time to repair the roof is when the sun is shining." Indeed, should the economic environment or market conditions rapidly change, as they did in March of 2023, the industry must be prepared. Joining the CLF now is an effective and prudent way for credit unions of all sizes to be prepared should liquidity storm clouds suddenly appear on the horizon. In sum, the CLF is a beneficial tool, and it should be part of any credit union's liquidity risk management plans for a variety of contingencies, not just during times of crises. Again, I will vote in favor of this budget. That concludes my remarks. I now recognize the Vice Chairman.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, Anthony. Presentation. So last year was the first year that CLF was its own distinct entity. It's got its own president and staff. If this goes well, I think separating the CLF from NCUA in that manner might provide focus and commitment to an important tool. Financial crisis, CLF played a very important role in the solvency of the credit union system and of the Share Insurance Fund. CLF funds were a substantial buffer for the American taxpayer. In fact, the CLF advanced credit unions in the system just over $18 billion back then. Without it, there's no question the credit union system would be significantly different today. It would significantly different in a worse way. Because even if there were a lot of mergers and we still had 22 billion in our fund, we want risk to be as diffuse as possible. We don't want a handful of big credit unions. That's much harder as an insurance matter. You want lots of little ones. Even though their risks are correlated, you still want as many variables as possible. CLF management kept this budget, the year we're talking about today, kept this budget to under 5% increase, with approximately 93% of that going to pay and benefits. There's no new positions allocated for 25 or 26. And the one new position approved for 2024, which has not been filled, will be offset, as I understand it, by a reduction in the contracting resources, making it budget neutral, at least for the purposes of this budget. Overall, the budget is relatively lean by some metrics compared to the growing CLF membership, operations, capital managed, the service provided. The expense to asset ratio is projected to be 0.22% for 2024. I should note that the CLF budget is admirably lean compared to the proposed NCUA budget we're discussing tomorrow. If the NCUA budget, staff proposed budget increase looked anything like the CLF budget, tomorrow's budget hearing would be a lot easier. I want to commend the CLF staff for being respectful of the people whose money we're spending. Any organization always has ways they could spend more money, some of which may even be good ideas. But NCUA has to live in the same world that credit unions do, that is to say, a world with limits. That is the kind of planning credit unions must do. And it's great to see budgets that are respectful of those paying the bill. The CLF's effectiveness, as the chairman mentioned, is dependent on credit unions being members of the CLF. Last year, we emphasized the need to make being a member, knowing you can be a member, how to get in touch with you, make all that as easy as possible. Anything we do from a user experience perspective puts the CLF on a to-do list. Yeah, I should get around to that, right? We want communication, get on it before there's a crisis. Anyway, so I want to commend you. Since then, the CLF took steps to improve the user experience, reorganized the website, simplified, streamlined, put the word application on the website for the first time. It was not. And there's a minor thing. Can I have a slide, please? This is, I'm using this meeting, as I think we all do, as a way to advertise that there's a thing called the CLF. It is a source of liquidity. It may be very useful. It will be useful in a crisis, and if you could see a crisis coming, it would not be called a crisis. This is a slide I used last year. This is how easy it is. NCUA space CLF in Google. It's literally the first result. I also did it with CLF space NCUA. It's also the first result. Click on that, and so I used this slide last year. Next slide, please. This is the slide I used last year, okay? And I mentioned a couple things. You have to apply to be in a CLF, right? There's
Yes.
an application.
Yes.
You could search all over this and you could not find the word apply or application. It said, please see operating circular 20-03. And I suggested normal people would not know. Remember, if someone looks at it, they don't find it, I'll get back to this later. We don't want that, right? We don't want anyone to do this. I often imagine people doing it on their phone. You don't have, just with their hands, so you don't have a lot of ability. And they'll say, all right, I don't see the application. Let me get back to this later. So this is what it was last year. And then next slide, please. Here's where I want to commend you. New section, join Essential Liquidity Facility. Nice. And the same exact link to the same exact thing now says complete and submit membership application. That I want to commend you for. I think that is useful. And then the other thing I mentioned, can you go back one, please? These are the only 3 slides I have. That phone number at the bottom. Last year I'd sent, go forward one. There's 2 of 3, number 2 of 3, there you go. The contact info, I think we've discussed it before. I think that contact info should be everywhere in the CLF. You shouldn't have to look for it. On the apply page, it says send an email, because you have to have that info, name your credit union, et cetera, et cetera. But I put the phone number there too, because people often have questions while they're filling out the form, and you don't want to have to go navigate to another page. But that email, I remember last year I tested it, I sent it, I got an email back in 19 minutes. It is monitored. And my goal here is to, one, commend you for the changes, but also use this time to advertise that applying for the CLF is not all that difficult. And it's one of those things that people do, and they say, wow, I don't know why I put that off so long. That was not hard. I should have done this a while ago. It's quite easy. And if you have any questions, how do I apply? How do I do this? And then obviously the phone number if you ever need money from it, once you're in it. That phone number, this is a very minor thing, but let me show what we did last year.
Liquidity Facility of the National Credit Union Administration.
Okay, and then it went to hold music, right? And it wasn't clear to me. I remember we said, what's happening during that hold music? Can it just say, we're now finding someone to talk to, which is probably what's happening, but it doesn't say that, right? I want to commend you for just that minor thing, because you might not know, what does this hold music mean? It just said, thank you for calling, and it went to hold music, okay? Hold on, wrong number. Let's call, here's what it is now, just so people know.
Hello, you have reached the Central Liquidity Facility of the National Credit Union Administration. Please remain on the line as we direct you to one of our representatives.
Okay, that's good. Please wait on the line. And tell me what happens when that hold music happens.
It actually goes through a series of numbers
It's a
of
phone
our
tree,
team,
right?
a phone tree, and which I'm included on as well.
And so if I had just left that on,
One of my
and
team,
nobody else hung up, eventually your phone would ring.
if none of my team members answered, my phone
You
number
put
would
yourself,
ring.
yeah. And if none of them answered, eventually, if I left it here, your phone would ring.
Certainly.
I'd answer. All right, I want people to know that it is monitored, it is a high-touch operation. So I appreciate those changes. I think they're little things that get this off people's to-do list. Anyway, I'm done with the slides. Thank you. We at NCUA continue to politely suggest that Congress consider reauthorizing the agent membership issue in the Federal Credit Union Act so that corporate credit unions are again able to join CLF on behalf of a subset of their members. That reauthorization will protect taxpayers and would not cost Congress a single dollar. Back when CLF did authorize that agent membership, an additional 3,300 credit unions, 3,300 small credit unions, less than 250 million, were CLF members. So that allowed the vast majority of credit unions out there to access emergency liquidity. And then following the expiration of that provision, the one that we are politely suggesting gets reauthorized, membership in the CLF fell, and 67% of all credit unions lost access to CLF. 95% of the credit unions under 250 million assets lost access. Now, it's true that during the COVID crisis, CLF wasn't used much because liquidity didn't become a major concern due to the flood of cash sloshing around the credit union system, right? That crisis, unlike the financial crisis, was met immediately with a flood of cash, so liquidity wasn't much of an issue. But we don't know that the next one, we may have, put it this way, a normal non-virus downturn. I'm pleased that in 2025, the CLF initiatives will continue to focus on growing membership through industry, stakeholder outreach, including talking to corporates and the leagues, and increasing access to backup sources of liquidity. I believe management of CLF is also planning to study outreach in 2025 and 26 by target marketing to those natural person credit unions that either require an additional backup source of liquidity per regulations, meaning they're getting close to the 250 million threshold where they have to, or a management assessment will greatly benefit from a source of liquidity. I recognize that CLF membership grows, so will demands for managing it, so we have to be prepared to do this, to manage this in a time of systemic stress. Okay, I want to review a couple things. One is, the L in camels, we already look at liquidity. Can you review why somebody who may already have some access to liquidity might want to consider the CLF also? Because there are different sources of liquidity. Fed, FHLB, you could have a bank credit line, you could have a number of things. But I believe these different sources of liquidity are different in how you get the money, how fast, in return for what, on what terms. So why would somebody out there who says, oh, I got something set up, what makes the CLF different than the other normal sources of liquidity? Why would someone want to also have CLF possibly in addition to other things?
Well, thank you for that question. So as we look at the continuum of liquidity, if you will, it starts with the balance sheet, and then the market sources of funding that include the corporates and the home loan banks, and then, of course, the contingent facilities like the discount window or the CLF. The CLF is important because those times when there's stress that the home loan banks or the corporates may not be able to provide the liquidity or may not be able to provide it at a decent enough rate for the credit union to get through its asset liability management issues, could turn to a guaranteed source, which will always be there, which is the discount window or the CLF.
And in terms of the process by which you get the money, the speed, what you have to pledge in return for it, differences between that and other methods,
Right, so.
between CLF and other methods?
Yeah, so there are advantages to having access to the discount window and advantages to, being with the CLF. We can't be the discount window. They're enormous. They have an incredible amount of resources and they can deliver money overnight. That's not what the CLF is for.
What about collateral?
Collateral,
Differences?
collateral accepted at both the discount window and the CLF are similar, although we tend to be very comfortable with the collateral that you'll find at credit unions.
More so than the
More
discount
so
window
than
might
the
be.
discount window might be.
Okay.
Right. And also, we don't require a borrower and custody agreement, which the discount window does, which can be a little bit onerous in setting up and also managing. We, at the CLF, can provide liquidity to our members depending on the size of the request in a fairly short time.
Gotcha, okay. I think most like people's households, I have different sources of liquidity personally, right? I have a credit card. I can get a margin loan from my brokerage. I have a home equity line of credit. Those are all different things with different types of collateral or none. And I use them differently because they have different terms. They all give me cash when I need it. But there's
Precisely.
different methods of accessing them, different days of the week, meaning some of them are easier to access on a Saturday, when, a long weekend, when can I actually have the cash in my hand?
Right.
So anyway, I think credit unions would be advised to check out if the different types of liquidity options might be useful, because they are different in the same way my home equity line, my margin account, and my credit card are all different vehicles with varying, and there's a right time to use each of them. That concludes my remarks.
Thank you so much, Vice Chairman Hauptman. I always appreciate your pragmatic, user-friendly approach to issues. I think it serves the system and this board well. Board Member Otska, you are now recognized.
Thanks, Chair Harper. And thank you, Anthony and Tim, for your presentation and you and your team's work for managing the CLF. So, I think we've touched on this. I think your presentation was pretty thorough. I think, the proposed CLF budget for 2025 is slightly increased over the 2024 budget. When accounting for the kind of the mandatory and appropriate staff salary increases and other mandatory increases, I think the increase is reasonable. And I support the CLF's plan to fill the full-time assistant vice president for credit position. This person would be responsible for loan applications, creditworthiness assessments, and function as the vice president in case of the current CLF vice president's absence. It provides that redundancy that's needed for continuity of operations and make sure that we can make sure that the CLF is well-staffed and functioning well. Making this a full-time role rather than outsourcing these services to third-party providers also allows for more consistent loan practices and safeguards business continuity in the event of leadership or other changes. And I think that's really important. We see this is accounted for in the budget by the accompanying decrease in contracted services. So that, I think that's a helpful offset, and I think ultimately serves the CLF and the credit union system well. We want to have that continuity if this is a liquidity backstop. As we continue to see rising delinquency rates and decreased loan performance across credit unions, it's even more important to have that strong liquidity backstop. And as my colleagues mentioned, the CLF is only as strong as the members that join. And I appreciate the work that you and your team has done to increase CLF membership and support a budget that invests in activities that will grow the CLF. Over the past year, we've seen the CLF grow by 31 members, 32 if you're counting October. And during the same period, assets have grown by about $91 million. Retained earnings increased by $3.4 million. And this is something that we and you all should be proud of. It's good to see the facility working as intended. But of course, we should continue to focus on that member outreach that you mentioned, and ensure credit unions see the value in joining, which again is very important. I think I want to note in particular that it's important to make sure that smaller credit unions have access to cost-effective liquidity options. The kind of cost-effective, easy to access part being really paramount. And I also want to note that there have been bipartisan congressional efforts to extend agent membership in the CLF, which would help smaller credit unions in particular. The CLF should be seen as an important tool in a credit union's liquidity management strategy. This budget proposal allows for a more efficient facility, increased member outreach, and better staffing to allow for more resilient continuity plans. I support the staff budget recommendation, and I appreciate your presentation. I have no further questions.
Thank you so much, Board Member Otska. Vice Chairman Haltman, is there a motion?
Yes, sir. I move that the NCUA Board, in its capacity as the Central Liquidity Facility Board, approve the 2025-2026 Central Liquidity Facility budget as detailed in the Board Action Memorandum.
Is there a second to the motion?
Second.
There is a sufficient second. All those in favor say aye.
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 All those opposed say nay. Let the record show that the ayes have it, and the motion passes 3-0. Now, Anthony, just before you leave the table, I do have one last question.
Yes.
5 of the country's top football teams are from the Big Ten. Could you expound on why the Big Ten is a better football conference than the SEC?
I hope you'll understand if I just say no.
I perfectly understand. May all Big Ten teams have luck this weekend and in the college football playoffs this year. That is the end of our agenda. I look forward to seeing many of you tomorrow at the annual NCUA Public Board Briefing on the in the NCUA Event Center on the agency's 2025 and 2026 staff draft budget. Additionally, on behalf of the board, I wish everyone an enjoyable Thanksgiving holiday. May your travels be smooth, your meals delicious, and your leftovers plentiful. There being no further business, we are hereby adjourned.